Dvadeseto stoljeće prepoznalo je pojam psihičke traume do koje dolazi zbog jako uznemirujućih događaja. No kako je pristupiti i kako je iscijeliti i danas je izazov. Suočena s tim pitanjem, američka traumatologinja Anngwyn St osvijestila je potrebu za proširivanjem pogleda na individualnu traumu time što će se povezati sa naizgled nepovezanim kulturnim, političkim ili povijesnim aspektima. Bio je to početak puta koju je s vremenom doveo do susreta sa sistemskim konstelacijama, koje je u Njemačkoj razvio Bert Hellinger. Iz perspektive sistemskih konstelacija, čudne činjenice da se traumatski događaji zbivaju na godišnjice prethodnih traumi, da su transgeneracijskog karaktera i da su nekako povezani sinkronicitetno, više nisu bile toliko čudne. Ali su zato zahtijevale drugačiji pogled na prirodu stvari. Poput uočavanja fraktalne povezanosti pojedinaca s obiteljskim sistemima, ali ne samo s njima, već i s regijama i s kulturnim krugovima, što je u konačnici dovelo i do prepoznavanja društvenih traumi i njihovih obrazaca ponavljanja. S time na umu pojavile su se nove mogućnosti pristupa i iscjeljivanju traumi. Mogućnosti koje su još uvijek ovdje, na rubu znanosti. Dobro večer. Anngwyn St je traumatologinja i kulturna povjesničarka koja je znanstvene stupnjeve stekla na Western institutu za društvena istraživanja i sveučilištu Kalifornije u Berkeliju, a kasnije je utemeljila u Arizoni Centar za društvenu traumu kojega je danas i ravnatelj. Dobro večer.
Thank you.
Kada bismo pričali o nečem što je danas uobičajen pojam kao što je trauma i vratili se malo u prošlost, kako su narodi ili ljudi prije 100 godina više prepoznavali i tretirali uopće traume, znači prije nastanka psihologije, psihijatrije i slično?
Thousands of years before, way back, the first trauma specialists were the medicine people and the shamans. And they understood the importance of the connection to nature, to community, to coming out of fragmentation into wholeness. And we're only coming back to that understanding now, because psychiatry, psychology is relatively new to the treatment of mental health issues and trauma in particular.
Kada zapravo stres postaje trauma? Jer svi smo stalno izloženi različitim stresnim situacijama, međutim nekako se ipak u većini slučajeva provučemo bez traume.
Yes, that's right, because humans are very resilient. And, you know, I too misuse the word trauma. When my computer crashes, I say, oh, I'm traumatized. I have computer trauma. It's not true. It's not true. That a trauma is not an upset. A trauma is not a shock per se. A trauma is a shock that persists because upsetting things happen, shocking things happen. And then we pass through it and we rebalance. Unless something is unfinished, something is overwhelming, something is too much, and we can't come back to the previous place before the event. And if it persists, then it's a trauma.
Danas pričamo o traumi, ali ne toliko u konvencionalnom smislu, više na način kako ste u svojih 10 knjiga i obradili. U njima postoje, rekao bih, pionirski koraci prema prepoznavanju traumi kao transgeneracijskih procesa. Putem ćemo doći i do toga, ali krenimo redom. Početak uočavanja tih čudnih povezanosti između traumatskih događaja u ljudskom životu bila su vaša istraživanja o ljudima koji su imali automobilske nesreće. Što ste tu uočili i na koji način ste uopće eliminirali sve one uzroke koji bi se mogli činiti da su vezani uz uzrok i posljedicu, a zapravo i nisu? I o čemu se u stvari radi kod automobilskih nesreća i o onom što vam je izvorno privuklo pažnju u tom smislu?
Okay. Well, again, what I rediscovered is what the shamans and the medicine people have always known. However, it came to me when I was working in a medical clinic in Boulder, Colorado, and it was something new in the community to have trauma specialists in a family practice medical clinic. And so the doctors in the community responded by sending us every patient they didn't know what to do with. And these patients were, for the most part, patients they didn't want anymore because they weren't responding to conventional treatment. And most of these people, I had a stack of medical charts, most of these people had had multiple automobile accidents. I mean, 10, 15, 20. And these were my patients, and these people were traumatized. And so I looked at these charts, and I was still thinking in a linear way. And I thought, well, this is not so mysterious. Obviously, these people have a problem with substance abuse. You know, they're driving impaired and so on. So I went through all the charts to see what I could find about the obvious, I thought. Not one of those patients had a substance abuse problem. And then I thought, oh, well, what is going on with people who are having 10, 15 accidents? So I was nowhere. And then I thought, well, what do I know? And I thought, one thing I do know for sure is that traumas tend to happen on the anniversary of previous traumas. So then I began to look at the dates. So together with my patients, who were mostly women, not all, but mostly, and I said, let's look at these dates, and can you tell me if these dates are meaningful to you in any way? So I was looking for birth dates, death dates, dates of previous traumas, previous accidents, and accidents tend to happen on the anniversary of previous accidents. I began to see a pattern. And I discovered something shocking that I didn't know what to do with, is what I found is with the women patients, they tended to have accidents on the anniversary of incomplete pregnancies. So the 3 dates when the accidents were likely to happen is the date of conception, the date of termination for whatever reason, and the date the baby would have been due. So I was quite alone with this hypothesis, as maybe you can imagine. And I asked my patients, please check your medical records to make sure that these dates are correct. And of course, the gynecologist, obstetricians thought I was mad. I said, this woman, she has this crazy idea, but my patients were very persistent, and they wanted to see the medical records, and the dates matched. So then I had a hypothesis, and I had an observation that this was happening, but I didn't know why. And then a patient came, and she had this pattern, and I said, I know that this is the pattern, but I don't know why. And she said, oh, makes sense to me. And I said, really? She said, yeah. She said, an incomplete pregnancy is a violent disconnection, and a collision is a violent connection. So then I began to think about field phenomena, something larger than the individual, that something else was going on in people's fields that was creating this pattern. And then I thought, what about the men in my practice who had this pattern? And also I had women who'd never been pregnant. So I began to look at the dates, and what we found is the dates of the accidents were the dates of separation. So it was divorce, immigration, emigration, abandonment, something that was really a violent separation, unresolved. So then I thought, accidents tend to happen on the anniversary of unresolved separation, that for some reason it comes together again in the form of an accident. And I thought, this is very abstract. And I don't understand exactly how this is, but I know that this is going on. And then, it was about 1997, Bert Hellinger came to Boulder. It was his first trip to the United States. And I'd heard about him in Germany, but I had never really seen him work, and I wanted to get a good look. So there weren't very many people there because the Americans didn't know who he was. And this sweet old man came and he sat down and he said, "Okay, who wants to work?" And I thought, what? No PowerPoint, no handouts, no interview, nothing. Just who wants to work? And he started to work with someone, and I realized, this man understands how to work with the field, the informational field. And this is what the shamans and the medicine people also know, as well as the importance of the ancestors. And then I thought, this is the missing piece in trauma work, that the way trauma work and psychotherapy in general is set up in the United States is basically an illusion that you're working with one person who had one issue. So there's one person and one trauma. And when you see the field and the field dynamics, you realize that's an illusion. You're working, I call this the ecology of intervention. You're working with every person that person is connected to. And this is very important for therapists because they think they see one person in front of them and they think, oh, I'm working with you and your trauma. But what I realized with the patterns of accidents and repeating traumas is there's no such thing as one trauma. Some people were traumatized before they were born. Some of us got traumatized being born. So it's not like a trauma or the trauma. So I began to think systemically, and that was a radical shift.
Postojali su ljudi i prije koji su na neki način uočili postojanje takvih obrazaca, recimo francuska psihijatrinja Anngwyn St, da je ne bi izgovorili na njemačkom, koja je to nazvala sindrom predaka. I općenito su primjeri navedeni u vašoj knjizi mnogi vrlo dramatični, recimo čovjek kojem su se otvorila vrata od lifta, ali nije bilo lifta i dok se on naginjao da pogleda gdje je lift, mu je lift odrezao glavu da bi se ustanovilo da u prošlosti je itekako neki predak njegov imao veze sa giljotinom u Francuskoj i slično, što je dosta drastično i jako rijedak slučaj koji pokazuje slični obrazac. U svakom slučaju, kada se već gleda individualna trauma iz te perspektive o kojoj ste govorili, ono kojim tragom ste dalje krenuli u knjigama, kad pričamo ne samo o transgeneracijskim povezanostima, nego i o prostorima i slično, jest pitanje vrijedi li ista pravilo i za nešto što bismo mogli nazvati društvenom traumom. Tu možemo spomenuti u ovoj emisiji često spominjenog Berta Hellingera, koji se naravno bavio idejom morfogenetskih polja, to gledatelji naši ove emisije već dosta dobro znaju. Zanimljivo je što se on između ostalog bavio mjestima koje je nazvao crne točke. Što je on uočio i kakve zaključke izvukao iz tih svojih, kako bi rekao, zapažanja o tome da postoje mjesta na autoputima gdje se stalno zbivaju nesreće, uvijek na istom mjestu, desetljećima?
Yeah, I've had the fortune, good fortune, to actually talk to Rupert Sheldrake about these things. And he's very involved in constellation work, by the way, as his wife. And he said when he was in a constellation for the first time, he said he knew about morphogenetic fields, but that was the first time he could see them. It made it real for him. And if you know anything about him, he's interested in everything. He's amazingly curious researcher. And he lived in, still does, in a remote part of England. And along the roadway in Great Britain, they have these traffic signs with a black spot. And this means, watch out. This is an area where many accidents happen. But he noticed that this was not a busy street at all. So he thought, well, why are accidents happening out in the middle of nowhere? So curious as he was, he looked into the history of place because he has the theory that places have fields of memory. So he looked into the history of the place where the black spot was, and it turned out that that particular place was a place where one of the bloodiest battles between the Protestants and the Catholics had happened in British history right there. So then the next question is, okay, if this field of memory is so dangerous, what to do? do you make it, in certain tribes they make it taboo, go to a place that has a bad field or a bad end. And he came up with the idea that what's needed, and Hellinger agrees with this, that representatives from both sides of the conflict need to come together in that place, and together they mourn the losses on both sides. And this is contrary to our usual practice with war memorials. We go and we mourn our own dead, but that doesn't resolve anything. In order for peace to be restored to one of these conflict zones, both sides from the conflict, or maybe all sides involved in the conflict, need to come together and all mourn all dead. And I thought, this is important.
Ako sam dobro shvatio, čitajući vaše knjige, prvi slučaj slične naravi s kojim ste se vi susreli, a da je bio doista dramatičan, jest danas već slavni, možda kod nas i ne toliko, u Americi svakako, masakr u školi Columbine u Koloradu, u gradu Little Town, kad su dvojica tinejdžera, rekli bismo iz čistog mira, poubijali svoje prijatelje i tako dalje, i to je stvorilo dugotrajnu traumu i za one koji su bili ranjeni, i za njihove roditelje, i za one koji su ostali invalidi i slično. No, kada se pogleda iz perspektive ovih poklapanja i na način na koji zapravo nitko prije nije gledao tu tragediju, kako biste, kojim tragom i koje poveznice ste uočavali koje nas dakle vode u tu transgeneracijsku, rekao bih i prostornu, rekao bih i transvremensku vezu u kojoj se odjednom ukazuje jedan jasni obrazac koji se iščitava i iz načina kako su ta djeca sebe vidjela u toj situaciji tih ubojica i što se prije zbivalo i slično. Što vas je taj slučaj u školi Columbine u Little Townu zapravo, možemo reći, naučio?
I was in Colorado at the time, not too far from Littleton, and this shocking news came on the screen. And the first thing that got my attention was that there's all this military language happening around a school shooting. And I thought that's something out of place. There's something there that doesn't make sense to me. So I began to look a little bit closer. So knowing Sheldrake's theory, I looked into the history of Littleton, Colorado, and Michael Moore actually much later made a film about it called Bowling for Columbine, and he noticed that it's basically a town that is dependent upon the weapons industry. It's a military town, and it's the home of Boeing, and they make missiles there. But I didn't know that at the time. I was looking more about the school itself, which is in Arapahoe County. And it's very interesting I've taken it off now, probably after I wrote about it. On the website for Littleton, Colorado was this big thing about the Battle of Sand Creek. And the interesting thing about the Battle of Sand Creek was there was no battle. It was a massacre. And it was a massacre where the United States cavalry soldiers basically massacred a group of Indians, mostly old men, women, and children. It was, and they were Arapaho. And the Sand Creek Massacre was somehow what Littleton was known for. And I thought, oh, now there's a massacre that's happening on the site of a massacre that was called battle, that was covered up, lied about, denied. And that's how fractals get going. We'll talk about fractals. But traumas tend to repeat when they're not resolved. Because then the question is, why do traumas repeat? And they repeat because something's unfinished. So it's like an interrupted movement in developmental history. It's like if there's an interrupted movement, something creates a fixation. Well, this Battle of Sand Creek was not, and so this field disturbance was in Arapahoe County, and for some reason, the town felt that they had to put that on their website. So that got my attention. Then from my work at the clinic, I said, I have to look at the date. And it was April 20th. Now, April 20th is a very interesting date in history, and it's also Hitler's birthday. So what I found out from that is that the boys were neo-Nazis, which was very interesting given that one of the boys was half Jewish. So then I thought, aha. So what came out in the news, and it dribbled out slowly, a piece by piece, but what came out is that the boys had kept very careful diaries. And in the diaries, they had written in some very bad German with lots of swastikas all over the place. They chose that date deliberately. However, they had two dates, April 19th and April 20th. And April 20th was the backup date in case they didn't get their 50 bombs into the school on time. So it's called the Columbine shooting. But according to the boys' diaries, they had 50 bombs, propane bombs, pipe bombs. And I thought, bombs? That's military. They're not talking about shooting, they're talking about bombs. So then I had this military fractal in my mind. So in the diaries, the boys wrote, we want to top McVeigh's body count. Now, who's McVeigh? At the time, it was believed that Timothy McVeigh was a combat veteran from Iraq who, it was believed at the time, was responsible for the Oklahoma bombing. And they said, we want to top McVeigh's body count. Body count is military language. Timothy McVeigh, the story was, he drove a kind of a bulldozer tank vehicle in Iraq, and one of our smart bombs hit an air raid shelter in Iraq, and thousands of women and children were incinerated. And it was his job to use this bulldozer to bury the dead. And the story is, in retaliation against the government, he said, this government is evil, we have to take this government out, that he supposedly engineered the Oklahoma bombing in revenge for what happened to him in Iraq. In other words, the story was he was a traumatized combat veteran. So I looked at April 19th, and it turned out McVeigh chose April 19th very deliberately, because April 19th was the anniversary of when the government raided the Waco complex where there was a religious community, and they didn't like what was going on in the community, and basically the government burned hundreds of families alive. And he was so outraged about Waco that he chose the Oklahoma bombing April 19th on the anniversary of Waco. The interesting thing about that also is that McVeigh was a member of what we call our militia. This is kind of the home guard. And this goes back to the Revolutionary War when we were a colony. And the first shot of the Revolutionary War against the British Empire was April 19th, 1775. So this April 19th fractal goes all the way back. And years later, I found out, high schools in the States have kind of a mascot. It's a horse, or it's an Indian, or it's... The mascot for Columbine High School was a Revolutionary War soldier. And outside the guidance counselor's office, in a glass case, was a Revolutionary soldier holding a gun. That's quite a fractal. And they couldn't get their act together on the 19th, so they did it on the 20th. So basically, people say, oh yeah, it was Hitler's birthday. That was not the original plan. The plan was the 19th. So you see how it plays out on a social level as well.
Da, ima tu doista puno poveznica. Ta tvrtka Lockheed koja radi projektila skoro 10.000 ljudi iz tog mjesta radi na bombama kojima se bombardiraju gradovi. Potom su ispred škole podigli opet kip poginulom vojniku u Afganistanu u punoj uniformi s bombama. Ovi dječaci su zvali svoju operaciju vojna operacija, kao što se ovaj masakr nad Indijancima zvao vojna operacija i slično. Zanimljivo je što je 20. travnja i Clinton potpisao antiteroristički zakon koji će kasnije prerasti u domovinski, kojim su naravno potisnute i uvedene politike nadgledanja i slično. Slične društvene traume se mogu uočiti, ako se mogu neke kratke poveznice reći, kod nekih drugih velikih događaja. Recimo u Americi je to, a i u svijetu danas sigurno 9.11. Ovdje u Europi, poglavito u istočnoj Europi, se u travnju 1940. recimo dogodio pokolj u Katinskoj šumi kada su Sovjeti poubijali poljske zarobljene vojnike. U travnju 2010. znači opet u istom mjesecu, se srušila avion s poljskom vladom koji su pak išli u Katinsku šumu, a opet kontekst poljsko-ruskih odnosa je doista složen i kompleksan po tom pitanju, tijekom povijesti svega tu bilo. Kakve ste poveznice uočili recimo na tim poljima kad se priča o društvenim traumama koje se dalje prenose kao da se na neki način umnožavaju ili kopiraju?
For me, the most fascinating one was Katyn. And Katyn is classic because it was denied, lied about, covered up. Because during the time of the actual massacre, it was blamed on the Nazis. And that's one atrocity the Nazis didn't do. The Russians did it. But the Allies, the British and the Americans, we were allies with the Russians, so we went along with the lie that, oh yes, this was the Nazis that did it. And so you have another one of these atrocities, which is covered up, lied about it, denied, and so it was bound to replicate. And when the president's plane crashed on the anniversary of Katyn, in Katyn, it is perfect, fractal. Because who was on the plane? The descendants of the victims that were buried at Katyn and the Polish elite. And who was taken by the Russians and massacred? The Polish elite. So it was almost perfect fractal with the people involved, the places involved, and the date.
Kada pričamo o tim informacijskim poljima kroz prošlost, bilo je ljudi koji su ih uočili. Evo, njemački psihijatar Albert Marr ih je zvao sveznajuće polje, Erwin Laszlo je zvao to psi polje, potom se kroz sistemske konstelacije mogu uočiti slični obrazci na individualnim sudbinama ljudi. Recimo, obitelj u kojoj tijekom 300 godina čak 3 čovjeka u dobi od 27 godina počine samoubojstvo, konkretno na 31.12. i slično. Znači, to su pak obiteljski obrazci koji se ponavljaju i u stvari se radi ovdje o nečemu što bismo mogli nazvati neravnotežom i jednom načinu u kojem taj sustav, u ovom slučaju transgeneracijski, obiteljski, može biti društveni, pokušava ući u ravnotežu. Zapravo, paradoksalno bi bio zaključak da ove tragedije se u stvari događaju zato jer se sustav želi uravnotežiti, mada i dalje stvara traume. Na koji način, i te traume mogu ići preko 10-20 generacija, na koji način se može nekako te obrazce liječiti? Recimo, opisujete da ste razvili nelinearnu metodu grananja i fraktala i pitanja prema ljudima u kojima ste tražili ne što s njima ne valja, nego što s njima valja i na koji način bi se mogle uočiti obrazci poput čovjeka koji je traumatiziran jer mu se otac napravio samoubojstvo s plinom da bi se ustanovilo da su njegovi preci bili Židovi u logorima koji su također pogušeni plinom. I sad kad vidimo da trauma predstavlja takva gruba lomljenja veza, kako se može ponovno stvoriti to spajanje i izići iz tog sindroma, da tako kažem, žrtve i uopće razlika između toga biti žrtva ili imati ideju da si žrtva? Na koji način ste počeli raditi s takvim stvarima kada ste ih jednom prepoznali?
I think sometimes a client comes and they know there's a pattern. Like 3 generations of men kill themselves on Christmas Eve. I mean, it's very clear. Most people come and they have no idea that there's any pattern whatsoever. And if that's the case, the first thing I want to know, does this date mean anything to you, of whatever the event was? And I'll say, does anyone else in your family or your life have anything like this? And I don't say the same thing because these patterns tend to come in similar clusters. Like you have whole family systems that are cardiovascular. So people have strokes, heart attacks, high blood pressure, congestive heart failure, that sort of thing. Then you have families, neurological families, where they have epilepsy or they have brain tumors or some other neurasthenic problems. And then you have families where they're generally healthy, but they all have accidents. So then you have the accident family. So I don't say the same thing. I say anything like this, because I'm looking for a generational or systemic pattern, which is not always, but usually there. And then I want to see how far back does this go. Very often, they don't know. But that's when the field comes in, because the field knows. So in constellation work, you can set up the pattern and see how far back it goes, because theoretically, at least, if you can find what was covered up, denied, or lied about, that wants to come to light, to come to truth, to come to balance, to come to reconciliation, then it stops and has no more need to keep repeating, because the repetition means it wants to be seen, it wants to resolve. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit like detective work. Mm-hmm. And for the client, that's more interesting than just seeing themselves as a victim of unfortunate fate or bad stars or some family curse or whatever it is. It's like, well, we're on an adventure together. Let's find out what's going on. And there's a different energy to an adventure than feeling like a victim. And this is one of the most controversial elements in systemic constellation work, because we make a very clear distinction between victimization, which is very real, and victim consciousness, which is something else. Mm-hmm. And in victimization, you've been victimized. That's real. In victim consciousness, the victim feels powerless, helpless, like they can't do anything for themselves. And in this consciousness, Hellinger says, and he's been severely criticized for this, that in victim consciousness, the victim doesn't take any more responsibility for their own life. I'm a victim. You have to take care of me now. I'm a victim. You owe me. And he says, he goes further with it. He says the victims are aggressive. And people don't like this. And it's really very complicated when you think about it cross-culturally, because, for example, in America, if you're a victim, what you want is money. You have to get a lawyer. And then you have to convince the jury how much you should be compensated. Whereas in Japan, if you're a victim, you become invisible. You become a non-person. And in some of the Latin American countries, they confuse victim with martyr. So you show what a holy person you are by how much you're suffering. And this is a very stuck place. But it's confusing for people, because there are images everywhere of very holy people who died in really horrible ways. And it's like, oh, if I want to be a saint or a holy person, then I have to suffer. And if I show my suffering, then everyone will know what a good person I am. So this is very confusing culturally.
Bert Hellinger je čak ustanovio da i sam čin opraštanja, ako nije na pravi način napravljen, zapravo nije odgovarajući iz razloga što opet je žrtva na nekakvom povišenom, recimo, moralnoj razini od počinitelja. Pritom se često put ne uzima u obzir da žrtve i počinitelji zapravo mijenjaju uloge. Primjerice i Izraelci i Palestinci smatraju sebe žrtvama. Ne moramo ići tako daleko. Kad bi se danas radila anketa na ulicama, recimo mi smo imali za sebe prije 25 godina rat i dan danas Srbi se smatraju žrtvama Hrvata, Hrvati se smatraju žrtvama Srba. Svaki ima neku svoju sliku povijesti i na neki način nitko zapravo se ne želi dovesti u donju poziciju i sad dati drugom priliku da zavlada nekakvim poljem. Je li sprječavanje lijek, odnosno na koji način bi se moglo pristupiti tome drugačije? U vašim knjigama se vidi primjer kada su pripadnika Irske oslobodilačke armije koji je bio u zatvoru suočili sa engleskim policajcem u kojeg je on pucao i naravno da su to bile potpuno nepomirljive strane. Tu su se dogodile zanimljive stvari kad su se oni suočili. Što se u stvari među njima dogodilo, jer možemo reći da je to bio slučaj u kojem je doista došlo do zalječenja i popravljanja odnosa koji se ni na koji način nisu popravili, možda još ni dan danas negdje tinjaju ispod.
Yeah, that's a very famous case. It's one of my favorites. Desmond Tutu was working with that. And what happened between the Irishman who was, in his mind, acting in good conscience, defending his country, that he didn't see himself as a criminal. But the policeman, whose job it was to control these people, saw him that way. So there they were. And it was very interesting, the policeman's family members were behind him with that. And the two were able to come to an understanding that each did what they did in good conscience. But the family members of the policeman did not come to resolution. And Hellinger pointed out two things about that. He said sometimes the victims have the hardest hearts. And sometimes when the victim can forgive or move on, the family cannot. And I thought that was very interesting, that they will hold the resentment. And I was very shocked when I first heard Bert Hellinger talk about, no, forgiveness is not the solution. And I thought, well, what is the solution? And the solution, he says, if somebody has wronged you and they say, please forgive me, then you're going to be, as you say, out of balance. He said, what you can say is, I have heard what you have said and I understand. And sometimes you don't understand. You can't understand. So then, I have heard what you have said, and I need time. Or, I have heard what you have said, and I will think about it.
I to je već dobar početak. Eto, zaključak između svih ovih primjera jest da traume zapravo imaju daleko više veze s kontekstom, ako ne čak i sve veze s kontekstom, nego sa onim vidljivim uzrocima i posljedicama, sa, ne znam, simptomima živčanog sustava i slično. I mada postoje obrasci koji su vidljivi, primjerice u engleskim zatvorima se pokazalo da su svi počinitelji maltretiranja bili žrtve obiteljskih nasilja, pa tu možemo ostati na ovoj svakodnevnoj razini koja uračunava linearnost vremena, pa reći ok, to je takav njihov obrazac. Međutim, ova poklapanja i svi ovi datumi, obrazci i stvari koje se zbivaju na određenim prostorima nas malo vode izvan tih obrazaca, rekli bismo, linearnog prostora i vremena. Na kraju krajeva i sistemske konstelacije pokazuju kao za alat koriste zapravo nevjerojatnu stvar da ljudi koji nikad nisu uopće čuli za nekog koga predstavljaju uspijevaju pokazivati i osjećati emocije drugih ljudi i to generacijama unatrag. Pravo pitanje je bilo što to govori u stvari o samoj prirodi stvarnosti, jer naravno Rupert Sheldrake je rekao da, znamo da postoje termiti koji grade svoje mravinjake po preciznom planu, makar se ne dogovaraju, znamo da postoje jata riba, ali ta društvena polja očigledno okružuju i tvrtke, korporacije, plemena, narode, skoro svaku grupu. Obitelj je naravno jedna od njih, ali u vašem slučaju ste otišli šire od obitelji. Što zapravo nam to govori o samoj prirodi stvarnosti? Kako vidite, jer u jednoj knjiga ste se bavili i prirodom vremena i naravno tu se opet pojavila fraktalnost koja sve češće iskače iz raznih polja i fizike i iz polja metafizike, iz polja biologije, a evo ovdje odjednom vidimo i na polju traumi, odnosno na polju društvenih nekakvih, možemo to tako nazvati, polja. Na koji način se fraktalnost i ta ideja teorije kaosa zapravo uklapa u tu priču? Čak i teorija kaosa možda ima malo pogrešan naziv jer se u stvari radi o teoriji reda, ali vidljivo iz neke više razine, da tako kažemo. U stvari se ne radi o kaosu, radi se o nevidljivom redu. Kako vidite vrijeme i prostor i fraktalnost u ljudskim odnosima, društvu i slično?
Well, it took me about 20 years to figure this out. And when I began seeing patterns, we had not yet discovered fractals, because fractals only really came into wider knowledge in the early 80s with Benoit Mandelbrot. And the fractals appeared as an error pattern on his computer. So I was seeing the patterns, but I didn't have a word for it. I didn't have an explanation for what I was seeing clinically. And then the first time I really traveled with Bert Hellinger, we were in a prison, and we had dinner that night, and I said, I had just learned about fractals, and I was beginning to put together trauma and fractals and time and space, and it was just beginning. And I said, Bert, you're working with fractals. And he said, I didn't call it that, but yes. And he said, let me tell you how I see it. He said, when I sit with a client, I see the client as like a piece of a leaf. And like in the Russian Kyrillian photograph, I'm sitting with a piece of a leaf, but I see the whole leaf. And I see that the leaf is attached to a branch, and the branch is attached to a tree, and the tree belongs in a forest, in a landscape. And that's how I see a client. And I thought, aha. As I learned more about fractals, I still hadn't made the connection with how is trauma a fractal phenomenon? What does this have to do with our human physiology, that it's manifesting in fractal patterns? And then I realized, looking at that fractals are everywhere, that if you look at a riverbed, or if you look at a river and you watch the riverbed and then it goes into the delta and then into the smaller streams and so forth, and you look at our circulatory system, it's the same pattern. And if you look at the seashells with the Fibonacci spirals, which are fractals, we have them in our bodies, we have them in our fallopian tubes, we have them in our ears. And then I thought, the human nervous system is made of axons and dendrites. Dendra is Latin for tree. That the shape of our nervous cells is fractal. That we have a fractal nervous system that interacts with a fractal universe. And that's why our experiences in space and time are often nonlinear and manifest in patterns. And that is when I decided to write Time, Space, and Fractals. Because one of the things, the most fascinating things about the informational field is it's timeless. When you step into an informational field in constellation work, you're nowhere in particular, and there's no past, no present, and no future. It's timeless. And what time is it when you leave Earth? I mean, what time is it in Arizona now? It's all very relative. And I began to see we impose a linear order, but the nature of the universe and our existence within it is fractal. And one of the things that happens with trauma is it knocks us out of linear time. And we often go into what we call disorientation, but it's also about being in a different place in time and space. And one of the things that happens with trauma is people get confused about time and space. But actually, time and space is not what it seems to be in any linear sense. This to me was a huge revelation.
Bert Hellinger je rekao da su morfička polja doduše lokalna, ali da rezonancija među njima nije. U knjizi koju ste spominjali da se bavite prostorom i vremenom, uočili ste odjednom i važnost percepcije i mjerenja vremena. Konkretno, pažnju su vam privukle Srednja i Južna Amerika koje su doživjele, svi znamo što, tijekom kolonizacija prije 400 godina. I oni su također imali, kao i mnoge druge nacije, vrlo napredne kalendare koji su imali sasvim drugačiju narav. Također su bili raznih duljina, mogli bismo reći isto fraktalni, za velika mjerenja, manja, kratka i slično. Međutim, tu se dogodila kontrola, kako ste rekli, kulturnog kalendara sa uvođenjem tog europskog katoličkog kalendara koji je bio nekakvoj dijametralno suprotnosti s tim drevnim opisima ritmova. I rekli ste da je došlo kroz kalendar do krize percepcije u razumijevanju vremena, prostora i prirode svemira. Na koji način je kroz vladavinu nad kalendarom došlo do toga što smatrate krizom percepcije, a zaključio bih iz vašeg razgovora da krizom percepcije smatrate neuviđanje te povezanosti fraktalne? Kako kalendari mogu služiti kao, recimo, da kažemo, sredstvo vladanja, pokoravanja ili slično upravljanja percepcijom?
Oh, calendars have been used since the dawn of time to control people, to control society, to control their understanding of space and time. And what we found in around 2012 was finally we were able to decipher the Mayan calendar. And I studied pre-Columbian art and architecture way back in the 70s. And the Mayan glyphs had not been deciphered yet, and the calendar was not understood. But by 2012, we understood that the Mayans knew that time is fractal. It's not linear. So along come the Europeans with their Gregorian calendar, and they said, no. This is, and these will be the sacred days, and the days will go like this. And see, the Mayan calendar, many people think the Aztec sunstone is the Mayan calendar. It's not. The Mayan calendar is not round. And it's calendars within calendars within calendars because they're different cycles of time. There's not one clock time. And they say, oh, no. This is time, it's linear, and these are how we're going to organize your society, your sacred days, your agricultural life. And it was political, totally political.
U svakom slučaju, od traumi koje su bile linearne preko traumi koje su bile transgeneracijske, a individualne, pa do društvenih traumi koje su također bile transgeneracijske, ali su pokrivale velike prostore, došli ste do pitanja prirode, vremena i slično, što zapravo na neki način pokazuje da, kako je stara izreka, točno svi putevi vode u Rim, ako Rimom smatramo neko dublje razumijevanje stvarnosti. Hvala vam na gostovanju i do neke sljedeće prilike do koje će, nadam se, doći kada...
It's been a pleasure.
Također. Hvala i doviđenja. Eto, hvala vama na pažnji. Transgeneracijska priroda traume, ako nešto pokazuje, onda pokazuje da nismo individue odvojene od bivših članova obitelji, niti od prostora i zajednice u kojima živimo ili s kojih stižemo, nego smo zapravo dio spregnutih sistema i ti sistemi nastoje postići svoju ravnotežu kada su izbačeni iz nje. To postizanje, te pokušaje mi naravno doživljavamo kao traumatične događaje, individualne kao i društvene. Ako se želi traumu iscijeliti, slijedi zaključak, potrebno je zapravo uočiti kakva je priroda neravnoteža u sustavu, kako je i kad nastala. Reklo bi se da već to osvještavanje čini da postane značajni dio rješenja koje se, baš kao i kod svake bolesti, ne može riješiti tretiranjem simptoma, već pronalaženjem uzroka, koji se, baš kao to isto čest slučaj kod fizičkih bolesti, nalazi u nekim neidentificiranim mjestima koja nazivamo nekad psihom, ali se ponekad radi o onome što se naziva duh mjesta ili pak kolektivno polje, neke uže ili šire zajednice. Svjetlija strana jest pak da u svijetu koji sustavno lomi veze među ljudima, ljudi se ipak nastoje povezati. I to pod svaku cijenu. Sljedeće povezivanje za tjedan dana. Laku noć.